Happy holidays, everybody. To celebrate, here's my review of Wasteland 2 Director's Cut for PC, Mac, Linux, PlayStation 4, and Xbox One. This is a party-based role-playing game and the sequel to the absolute classic role-playing game Wasteland. It was developed by In Exile Entertainment and released in September of 2014 for PC, Mac, and Linux, and the Director's Cut saw release in October of this year across both those systems and the new console releases for PS4 and Xbox One. And it's interesting for a variety of reasons. First off being, it's the sequel to the original Wasteland, which, if you're not familiar with, I don't really blame you because the game came out in 1988. It was one of the really early examples we have of an actual role-playing game. And it was the inspiration for a little game series you may have heard of by the name of Fallout. You see, there were some difficulties that Interplay had with actually securing the Wasteland name from Electronic Arts back in the late 80s, early 90s, so they couldn't really make a full-on sequel to Wasteland once they kind of parted ways from EA. And while there was a sort of sequel to the original Wasteland called Fountain of Dreams, it wasn't really billed as a sequel, and you'd be forgiven for just forgetting that it existed entirely, because it was just kind of a footnote in gaming history. So when Interplay decided to actually work on something in the vein of Wasteland, they made the original Fallout in 1997, and the rest from there is pretty much history, although it kind of begs the question of, well, what happened to Wasteland 2? Why didn't it come out until so long after the original game? Well, like I said, they had rights issues with the name until they finally secured the rights from EA and took to Kickstarter. And this is one of the big Kickstarter success stories as far as video games go. They had a very, very big success with the actual funding campaign. And when the game finally came out, apart from the bugs, it was pretty well received across the board. So let's go ahead and delve right into this thing and take a look at what sets Wasteland apart from Fallout for one, and more importantly, how this thing fares as a party-based role-playing game in and of itself, and as a sequel to the original Wasteland. Now, I should make it clear that I have played the original Wasteland, just not to completion yet. So keep that in mind as I'm going through this review. I'm mostly going into Wasteland 2 as its own entity rather than an actual sequel to the original Wasteland, even though it very much is the proper sequel to Wasteland. Well, let's start with the presentation, which is modest, for lack of a better term, or just to term it nicely, I should say. It runs on the Unity engine, and it is a sort of isometric perspective. You can move the camera around a bit, and it is 3D rendered, but it's always a third-person kind of tactical viewpoint, so you don't really get too close to the action for the most part. You can zoom in if you really want to, and what you will find is that while some things look pretty good, actually, usually the environments, which are very well detailed for the most part, there's a lot of stuff in them, and they come across as very believable, surprisingly enough, considering this is a post-apocalyptic game, as environments where people actually could live, or had lived in the past, or something like that. The characters, on the other hand, have some kind of clunky animations. There's a lot of clipping going on with regards to the actual weapon models as to how they're holding them. For example, if your character is holding the AUG assault rifle, it clips through their arms something fierce and looks pretty horrible. But other than that, they look alright for what they're going for, which, a game like this, you don't really need standout graphics. You need something that works really well, and you need something that is fitting for what you're trying to do. What they were trying to do is create a sort of tactical RPG in which you usually view things from a fairly far out perspective, and that works very, very well for this game. It's when you try to zoom in that you run into problems. But here's the thing, you don't need to zoom in for the most part. You can just hold the Z key, at least that's what I have it bound to. It may be different for you depending on what your preferences are and such. But you can hold that key down and it will highlight interactable objects in the world, and you do pretty much everything else with the mouse. And it behooves you to constantly stay in a sort of zoomed out perspective so you get a much better view of the battlefield and what you've got going ahead of you and such like that. So the graphics being, well, dated, don't really become a detriment to the game. It's just something that when you zoom in, you just kind of go, ooh. But then you zoom back out and you don't really care as much because you're playing the majority of the game in that zoomed out perspective. And from that perspective, everything looks fine. Like I said, you're mostly worried about the environments in that case, and those look just fine. Now that said, there is a bit of a lack of color in this game, and again, it's a post-apocalyptic game, so I don't really expect too much color. But in the early parts of the game, when you're in Arizona, you find that the environments start to wear on you after a while because there's a lot of brown. I mean, it's a desert, what do you expect? But at the same time, it's wearing on you quite a bit. Then you get to California, and suddenly there's a lot of lush greenery. And it's incredibly refreshing. So just keep that in mind if you go into this thing. It does get better as it goes on in terms of the visual palette. That said, it won't be winning any awards for its visuals nor for its sound design either. The sound effects work, and that's about all I can really say for them. They're a lot of stock-ish sounds and a lot of stuff that you would have heard in a lot of other games or in movies or anything like that. So it's nothing that's particularly bad, nor is it anything that's particularly great. And as far as the rest of the sound goes, you've got the voice acting, which ranges from rather good to very amateurish. And in a sort of indie project like that, you kind of expect this, but with the budget they had, it's almost disappointing in the voice acting department. Luckily, most of the voice actors do a pretty good job, so it doesn't really wear on you too much. It's just occasionally you'll run into that one character here and there that will just be like, "Ooh, who voiced this guy?" But then there's the saving grace of the sound design, which is the music by Mark Morgan. And if that name does not sound familiar to you, it should, because he made the music for the original 2 Fallout games. And they both had excellent soundtracks that really did set them apart from other games of the time. This one, on the other hand, is not really so much a very unique soundtrack. It's that it's incredibly fitting for what it is. Lots of music that feels right at home in a post-apocalyptic game, and it also goes out to the West nature of it. I mean, a huge chunk of the game is set in Arizona, and you've got a lot of acoustic guitar to go with it. And so it works very, very well for what they've done, only some of the tracks are just not quite as memorable as something like, say, the original Fallout or Fallout 2. Still a very good soundtrack, just made with a sort of singular purpose in mind, which was to fit a post-apocalyptic RPG. And it definitely does that. But ultimately, as mixed as the presentation can be, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay. Story in this is set in an alternate history in which a nuclear holocaust occurred in 1998. And to bring you up to speed on what happened in the original Wasteland, the idea was that after the nukes fell, a company of Army engineers were in a sort of desolate desert region doing construction work, and they ended up taking over a prison and making that their new base of operations, eventually becoming the Desert Rangers, an outfit clearly inspired by the Texas Rangers and the Arizona Rangers that was trying to bring law to a lawless land and help the other survivors that were in the desert and wherever else they could spread out to. Now, the events of the original Wasteland involved a killer AI trying to basically wipe out all of humanity in the area so it could create a sort of pure race of its own, and obviously you were the party trying to stop it from doing so, and in the process you ended up basically destroying the base. In Wasteland 2, the default party from the original Wasteland is now basically the leaders of the Desert Rangers, and it's all under the leadership of General Vargas, or as he used to be known, Snake Vargas, and they are trying to expand operations and bring law to this lawless land. And that's where you come in. You are Ranger Team Echo, a newly recruited Ranger team that is immediately sent on a mission to investigate the death of one of the original Desert Rangers, which is Ace. And you're trying to find out, first off, what killed him, because you're not entirely sure, and you're trying to find out what he stumbled upon. From there, it basically involves you investigating more into what you find out as you investigate Ace's death, which is almost a rehash of the original Wasteland in a lot of ways. And by that, I mostly mean the fact that the primary antagonists in the game are robots and synthetic humans, or synths. And that's not to say you won't be fighting other things throughout the course of the game. I mean, there's plenty of human elements. For example, the pretty much completely insane God's militia, which are hell-bent on cleansing the Wasteland of all sinners, so to speak. Now, of course, there is more to them than just that, and that's the case with the vast majority of the sort of antagonistic elements you run across in the Wasteland. You can't necessarily describe all of them as evil, because every single group does have its own goals and does have its own methodology for doing things. And depending on your point of view, you may want to side with one faction or another just based on what your own personal beliefs are. Or you can do things from a purely practical standpoint if you really want to. There's all kinds of things you can do with regards to the various factions, the various characters throughout this game, that will influence the outcome of the storyline in different ways. Siding with one faction may preclude siding with other factions. Doing one particular thing as a sort of peace offering may completely change the outlook of an entire area. Doing one thing can come back to bite you later, or it can come back to reward you later. There's a lot of choice and consequence in Wasteland 2 that is done very, very well for the most part. Some things are fairly binary. The first big decision you make between saving the Ag Center or saving High Pool is a fairly binary decision, but it does have definite ramifications in the aftermath, and it can have ramifications for hours. And this is the kind of game where speech skills come in great handy. There were so many instances throughout the game where I was able to completely avoid encounters or achieve wildly different outcomes than what you might think, just based on the fact that I had maxed out all three of the dialogue skill sets. Those are hard-ass, smart-ass, and kiss-ass, which are, of course, three separate skills for being diplomatic, which is kiss-ass, or being intelligent and trying to outwit your opponents and such with smart-ass, or just being intimidating, which is hard-ass. And through a combination of these three things, I was able to achieve all sorts of different outcomes that I know I wouldn't have been able to achieve without them. And that is a massive breath of fresh air in an era where games are starting to move further and further away from actually being RPGs and more just being action games or something like that. And along comes Wasteland 2 to show them that, hey, not only can you do this, but it's also incredibly satisfying when you do it. So even though the main plot just kind of meanders on through most of the game, you're not really caring about that so much as you're caring about more what you're doing in the Wasteland. Are you making a difference? What is the perception that the Rangers are going to have based on your actions? All these sorts of things make it more than simply following a main storyline and having a bunch of side activities. It all feels like it's blending together to make a very cohesive, open world-ish RPG experience. I say ish because there are several parts of the game that are fairly linear, but even those still allow you to mess around with some choice and consequence, so you don't really feel necessarily like there is linearity in this thing, even though it is there. You feel like you are always given options. And even though it does often force you into combat or force you into some linear segments, they don't really feel like they were truly forced upon you. They just feel like a pretty natural extension of what you were doing anyway. I mean, let's face it, you start digging around in an enemy's base by sneaking in there. If they notice you, they're probably going to freak out and start attacking you. Or if you do something to just seriously mess with one faction, they're probably going to hate you for it, and they'll come after you, and such like that. The only enemies that really feel forced upon you are the synths and the robots, and those are pretty much explained away in a fairly hand-wavy manner that happens toward the end of the game, so I really don't want to spoil that for you. But it's a bit contrived, and ultimately it just kind of detracts from the ending of the game, even though there is a lot leading up to that is pretty interesting. It's just that whole thing probably could have been avoided had they not clung a bit too much to the original Wasteland's story elements. And that's about as far as I'll get without spoiling anything for you. But that said, I did find the resolution to the main plot, the one involving synths, robots, Ace's death, and all that, to be a bit weak. The rest of the stuff mostly resolved just fine. In fact, that was the more interesting parts of the game, when you're actually dealing with the consequences of your actions in these various communities and such throughout the game. When that stuff comes up, it's like, oh, I made a difference. I actually did this stuff that actually made the balance of power shift in the Wasteland. That's really cool. The main plot itself ends and you're just kind of like, eh. So really the main strength of this game is not so much in its main plot as it is in its world building. They do that extremely well for the most part. You look at the various communities scattered throughout the Wasteland and go, I could probably believe that this would be a thing, even though some of it is a bit wildly exaggerated. For example, the Mannerites. They are a society built entirely around nauseatingly correct manners. And you know right off the bat that something's really off about them, but I'm not going to spoil that for you. It's just that things like that pop up all over the place in Wasteland 2. It has a kind of offbeat, often rather dark sense of humor. So even when you do run across things that are just blatantly morally reprehensible, and they are portrayed as such, it still has this kind of undercurrent going through of, hey, this game's kind of ridiculous. And we just kind of roll with that. The original game had that same kind of mentality. You would have these kind of goofy messages scattered throughout the game. For example, the enemy exploding like a blood sausage. Who knows what that's supposed to mean, but it's offbeat and kind of quirky, and that's something they reference repeatedly throughout Wasteland 2. There's a lot of callbacks to the original Wasteland here. But there's also a lot of references to other things as well. References to gaming things throughout history, references to pop culture, all sorts of things like that. And it's all thrown in with this heavy dose of really sarcastic wit that makes it hard not to find something to at least chuckle at. And if the rather over-the-top death animations where someone will shoot another person with just a basic pistol and suddenly their entire torso blows off or things like that doesn't do it for you, then maybe something like finding random crap in toasters scattered throughout the Wasteland where an entire skill is devoted to repairing toasters so you can get these items, and running across the most random nonsensical crap you can in them, like a friggin' bass guitar, for example, will tickle your funny bone. Regardless of what ultimately makes you laugh in this thing, it's still incredibly endearing to have this game dealing with a lot of pretty dark subject matter have this kind of offbeat black humor in it that is just really refreshing, because we don't really get that very much in modern video games or just video games in general. It really does set this thing apart, and while Fallout did have some of that, it wasn't quite the same sense of humor. And while Fallout always has kind of reveled in just how completely absurd it is, Wasteland's a bit more grounded than that, and really it uses its humor to kind of offset the really serious material that it's often going with, and the fairly serious portrayals that it's giving. So while it might seem like an odd juxtaposition to have such weird silliness in a game like this where there's a lot of really grim and serious subject matter, it just works. It's kind of hard to describe just how it works, but it works. And speaking of working, that's just how most of this game is. It just plain works, and it works well for the most part. You're dealing with a party-based isometric tactical RPG. You start off with 4 characters that you can create or just use pre-made characters for, and these come with a variety of stats like strength, coordination, intelligence, such and such, that will give you different bonuses and detriments depending on what your levels in each of those stats are. It's better to specialize than it is to simply get everybody well-rounded. And there are a lot of skills to specialize in. I mean, you've got your various weapons: assault rifles, shotguns, sniper rifles, pistols, submachine guns, heavy weapons, brawling, bladed, and blunt weapons. So 9 categories of weapons. And on top of that, you also get thrown weapons that are basically grenades and TNT and stuff like that. So you've got a huge variety of equipment available to you and all of the skills to supplement that. But this is not a game solely about fighting things. Yes, it is a fairly major portion of the game, but you need to round those out with some other skills to specialize in as well. Demolitions. You're going to run into a lot of landmines. You need to be able to disable them. And like landmines, you're also going to run into a lot of locked doors, and those can be opened via either just plain lockpicking or via the computer skill, where if it's an electronic lock, you can use that and bypass the lock. You might also use the computer skill to get into mainframes or to hack enemy cyborg units or robots or something like that to get them to fight on your side for a while. There's alarm disabling if you want to kind of take the back route and try to sneak around your enemies and be able to get into things without them noticing and just avoid combat entirely. There's all three of those social skills that I mentioned that have tons of use throughout the game. It's not simply you use this once or twice. No, you use them all the friggin' time, and for a variety of different things. You might be able to get just some extra scrap out of it. Scrap is the in-game currency. You might be able to access a previously inaccessible area. You might be able to get an entire quest line. And then there's other things. I mean, brute forcing your way past things is certainly an option. You have a skill set for that. There's a skill set for finding things in the overworld map called Outdoorsman. You find both caches and mysterious shrines, which will give you bonuses to skill points and experience points. You find all sorts of enemies that will try to do random encounters with you, and the higher your outdoorsman is, the easier it is to evade them if you just don't want to bother fighting them altogether. And still there's other skills like perception, which allows you to first off spot landmines and traps and things like that, as well as spot things like different details that you wouldn't have noticed beforehand if your perception skill wasn't high enough, and might open up new dialogue options or different possibilities and things like that. So all of the skills have a use. Nothing in this thing is superfluous. And you will be able to find books throughout the game that will allow you to increase certain skills by 1 point. Although it's a one use and you're done with that book thing. So you have options throughout the game for just increasing your skills as you go along. And as you increase your skills, you will eventually get access to various perks that will give you different significant bonuses. For example, there is a perk in the safe cracking and lockpicking tree that makes you never actually do critical failures when you are trying to pick a lock or get into a safe or something like that. There's perks for additional types of damage depending on what weapons you're using or what enemies you're fighting and such like that, all of which give an additional layer of specialization and bonus to the party makeup. There's also trinkets you can get that will occasionally give you different bonuses to certain skills at the cost of certain attributes or things like that. So they definitely provide you with the tools to build a party of your own liking. And they give you 4 characters to start with an additional 3 slots. You can fill these in with various characters that you will encounter throughout the Wasteland. So right from the get-go, you're going to have to learn the ins and outs of the combat system pretty quickly. Every character has action points that they can spend to either move around or take various actions during combat. These can be things like shooting at things, setting up ambushes, which if you've played XCOM is basically like Overwatch. If something moves within their line of fire, then they will actually open fire on that target. The action points can also be used for things like your medic healing other characters in the party if they've been injured, or being able to revive them with trauma kits and such like that. Or in some instances, you can even use skills during combat scenarios. For example, you might need to hack into a enemy robot in order to bring it over to your side. And so you do have a variety of things you can do. It is a turn-based combat system, of course, and they do have cover bonuses. These will give you bonuses to just not getting hit, as well as getting bonuses to your 2-hit chance. So it behooves you to always be in cover. Thing is, you have to keep in mind that some cover can be destroyed. And you also have to keep in mind that cover only applies if it's in the direction that the attacks are coming from. If somebody gets behind you or to the side of you, then you don't really get a cover bonus anymore, so it is actually pretty important to be aware of tactical positioning at all times. And early on in the game, when you don't have a full party, you're going to need to worry about that constantly, because positioning will get you just wiped out pretty quickly. So by the end game, it's all pretty much ingrained into your brain, and you don't need to think so much about it anymore. You just kind of go and do it. So it's a pretty simple and straightforward turn-based tactical combat system that you learn the ins and outs of pretty quickly, and it never really becomes too much of a bother, even when you do have a pretty low number of characters to start with. luckily, and it really won't be that long before you do have a full party of 7 and can thus basically deal with whatever you're going up against, as long as it's within reason. You see, there is one thing that this game does that the original did as well that will immediately put newer players off. It is very unforgiving in its difficulty. If you screw up and go into an area that you're not supposed to be in until later on in the game, it will let you know by doing a full party wipe. The mantra of save early, save often comes to mind, and it does encourage you to go around, explore things at your own pace. It's just like, hey, you're not going to go into this area until you're good and ready, right? And then you go in there, and it tells you, right? So you go back and you do other things, you come back there when you're more powerful, and you find that you can actually manage it. Now here's the thing, for the most part, that's a pretty manageable thing. It's pretty reasonable to expect the game to just kind of punish you for going into places you're way too low level to be in. It's another thing entirely when you have pretty much exhausted everything there is to exhaust in one portion of the game, which is the Arizona bit. And then you decide you're ready to go on to the next portion, which is California. And that's where you hit the difficulty wall. And you hit it hard. Now, it should be noted, I wasn't playing this thing on a particularly high difficulty. I was only playing it on Seasoned. That's the normal difficulty setting. There's a setting below that called Rookie, and then there are 2 settings higher than that. And it is downright punishingly difficult at times. There are times when you fail to run away from a random encounter and you'll get a total party wipe and have to reload a save. But it's especially bad once you get to California, because that's where it starts to throw all the high level enemies at you with the really good gear. And once you get leveled up a bit, right around level 35 to 40 or so, it's manageable. But until that point, you're going to be scraping by in pretty much every encounter you come across. And all those heavy weapons you've been holding on to, like the rocket launchers and such, they'll get really useful at that point in the game. You do not want to waste those things. They're very scarce. And there was one fight in particular that drove me crazy, which involved going up against a lot of synths all at once. And they do absolutely ludicrous amounts of damage and can take absolutely ludicrous amounts of damage. So my weapons, which I thought were pretty good at that point in the game, were really not sufficient to take them down. So I had to waste all of my launchers and grenades and stuff on these guys, and barely even managed to come out of that with the whole party intact. And it took numerous tries. So that highlights the really major downside that Wasteland 2 has. It's an excellent party-based role-playing game. It does fantastic things with the role-playing, fantastic things with the world-building. It has some pretty good dialogue for the most part. It's got a great sense of humor. There's just so much to see and do, and you feel like you are actually making a difference in the game world. But it is not for the faint of heart. If you are used to modern RPGs that hold your hand throughout, this thing will chew you up and spit you out. The only hand-holding you get is explanations of what various things do in-game. And that's something it gets from the original Wasteland. The original Wasteland basically told you nothing on top of being absolutely brutally difficult. And it was to the point where even people who were used to other RPGs of the era being pretty much the same way still found the original Wasteland to be a pretty punishingly difficult game. And while Wasteland 2 gives you difficulty options and is a hell of a lot more manageable than the original Wasteland, it will still smack you around quite a bit if you were going in expecting a cakewalk. And in fact, it was kind of funny going from Arizona to California in this thing, because by the time I went to California, my characters were all about level 30. They had the best gear that they could get in that particular part of the game, and I'd pretty much run out of things to do in Arizona at that point, so I decided to take the party to California to advance the plot and get access to the more endgame content. And I'm like, okay, we can totally handle anything that the game throws at us. And basically, first encounter, I had a near total party wipe. Talk about humbling. At that point, the game was like, oh, you think your party's awesome. You got another 20 levels to go, buddy. And while the encounters themselves were a hell of a lot more punishing in that part of the game, the content itself was just as interesting, if not more interesting, than what was in Arizona. So, while it does have a few pacing issues between the middle and end game portions, the struggle was ultimately worth it, and I think that's what you need to take away from this thing. This is a game made for a specific audience, the kind of people who played the original Wasteland back in the day, or even not necessarily back in the day. The kind of people who would kickstart a project like this. It's catering to the old school RPG fan demographic. And in that particular context, it succeeds brilliantly. But that does ultimately make it a niche game. Because, let's face it, how many people do you know are willing to actually put up with a game that will just completely and utterly kick your ass half the time? But if you're willing to put up with all that, if you're willing to put up with the occasional bugs and glitches that this has, which were a hell of a lot worse than the original release, the director's cut is considerably better in that regard. But if you're willing to put up with those things, and if you're wanting a deep RPG experience that allows you to really feel like your characters are making a difference in the world around them, if you want world building to be a huge thing in your RPGs, if you want to really have that strong choice and consequence with all of the side stuff building up this world around this main plot that just kind of takes you through the course of the game, then you will find Wasteland 2 a superb experience. But if you're too used to modern games pampering you constantly, then you probably won't be able to get much out of it. You may prove me wrong, but it's just a suggestion. Ultimately though, I give Wasteland 2 a 4.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.